He walked on stage with the quiet posture of someone who'd spent his life teaching others to shine. A Filipino English teacher with a borrowed blazer and a trembling voice. When he said he'd sing Creep, Simon Cowell raised his hand to stop the audition. The crowd gasped, everyone thought it was over. But it wasn't. Long before bright lights and roaring crowds, his world was a small classroom in Manila, where chalk dust floated like tiny snowflakes and laughter echoed through thin wooden walls. His name was Mateo Cruz, and he was the kind of teacher who believed his students weren't just learning English, they were learning how to believe in themselves. Every morning, Mateo arrived before sunrise. He would sweep the floors, organize the mismatched plastic chairs, and write encouraging quotes on the worn-out board. Then he'd sit by the open window and watch his students file in, some barefoot, some carrying borrowed notebooks, but all wearing hopeful smiles. The community was poor, yes, but Mateo knew that education was the only ladder tall enough to climb out of hardship. Music had always been Mateo's secret sanctuary. After class, when the children ran home, he stayed behind to tune old guitars and test microphones for the school choir. But when others suggested he sing too, he always laughed it off. "Ayoko, I'm better as a teacher," he would say. "I'm not meant for the stage." But his students didn't see it that way. To them, Mateo's voice was something pure and rare, something that made you feel seen. One rainy afternoon, while the electricity flickered, one of his students named Jonah approached him with a serious expression. Jonah was small, quiet, always sitting in the back. He felt invisible in a world that never slowed down enough to notice him. But that day, he held out a folded piece of paper and said, "Sir, can you read this?" It was a handwritten letter, an invitation for Mateo to audition for America's Got Talent. "Our class thinks you should go," Jonah explained, eyes downcast. "We want America to hear your voice." "Like we do." Mateo was stunned. "But the plane ticket alone, we know," Jonah interrupted. "That's why we did bake sales every Friday. And our parents helped too. Even the sari-sari store auntie donated. We saved enough for one plane ticket." Mateo felt the world tilt. These children who barely had enough for lunch had spent months raising money not for themselves, but for him. It wasn't just kindness, it was sacrifice. He didn't know what to say. Teaching had never been about personal glory. It was about giving, guiding, reminding kids like Jonah that they weren't defined by their circumstances. And now, in a beautiful twist of fate, these kids were giving back. On the day he left for the airport, the entire class lined up outside the school gate. They waved small paper flags and held signs made from recycled cardboard that read, "Go, Sir Mateo, and make them hear our story." Before he stepped into the taxi, Jonah handed him a small envelope. Inside was a simple index card that read, "Dreams are scary, sir, but you taught us to chase them anyway." Mateo folded the card gently and slipped it into the pocket of his borrowed blazer. He promised himself he would keep it there until the very end, no matter what happened on that stage in America. The moment Mateo stepped onto the America's Got Talent stage, he felt as if the room itself breathed in. The stage lights were blinding, far brighter than anything he had known back in Manila. The judges' table sat like a fortress of expectation. Simon Cowell, Sofia Vergara, Heidi Klum, and Howie Mandalore watching, analyzing, waiting. But what shook him most wasn't their presence, it was the audience. Thousands of faces staring down at a man who had spent his life speaking to children in a classroom small enough to stretch your arms across. Now, here he was, standing in front of America, clutching a microphone that felt heavier with every heartbeat. "Hello," Howie began. "What's your name, and what do you do?" "My name is Mateo Cruz," he said, voice trembling. "I'm from Manila, in the Philippines, and I'm a teacher." A small wave of applause followed, warm, genuine, but Mateo could feel the unspoken question lingering in the air. What is a teacher doing here? He cleared his throat. "My students are the reason I'm here today." Those words steadied him, as if the children back home were placing hands on his shoulders. Guiding him forward, Simon narrowed his eyes slightly. "And what will you be singing for us?" Mateo swallowed hard. Creep, by Radiohead." A ripple of surprise passed through the audience. It wasn't a typical showstopper song, it was raw, vulnerable, almost painfully honest. "Interesting choice," Simon said, folding his hands. The music cued, and Mateo opened his mouth to sing the first line, but his voice cracked. Not badly, not disastrously, just enough to reveal fear. He tried again, but the timid sound barely carried through the speakers. The room felt suddenly too big. The lights too harsh, the microphone too loud. His hands began to shake. He thought of his students watching from a small classroom in Manila, and shame pricked the corners of his eyes. And then Simon raised his hand. The music halted instantly, like someone had cut the strings of a puppet show. The audience gasped. A few whispered. One woman in the mezzanine even groaned, assuming the worst. Mateo froze. His throat closed. He stared at Simon, waiting for the words that would end everything. But instead, Simon leaned forward, elbows on the desk, studying him not with disdain but with curiosity. "Mateo," he said calmly, "who are you singing this for?" Mateo blinked, caught off guard. My students," he whispered. "No," Simon said, shaking his head slightly. "Who are you really singing for? Who are you thinking of when you sing these lyrics?" Mateo's voice was barely audible. "The kids who feel small. The ones who don't belong." A hush fell over the arena. Simon nodded slowly. "Then don't apologize for your voice. Don't hide behind nerves. Sing it like you're standing in your classroom, and one of them needs to hear it." And just like that, the atmosphere shifted. The stop wasn't rejection, it was permission. Permission to be honest. Permission to feel. Permission to bleed through the song. The music restarted, softer this time, as if the orchestra itself was holding its breath. Mateo inhaled once, closed his eyes, and began again. This time, he didn't sing for judges or cameras. He sang for the invisible kids. The second, Mateo opened his mouth again. Something in the room shifted so subtly that only those truly paying attention noticed it. His voice was still fragile, still trembling, still imperfect, but it carried something rare: sincerity. The kind of sincerity that can't be faked. The kind that comes from years of wanting to say something and never finding the right moment. "When you were here before," he sang, the words quivering through the air like exposed nerves. He wasn't just singing lyrics, he was confessing. Confessing what it felt like to grow up feeling like background noise. To teach children who think they aren't meant for big dreams. To walk through life convinced that the world had assigned you a role and that challenging it was an act of rebellion. Up in the balcony, a mother leaned forward, clutching her daughter's hand tighter. In the second row, a teenage boy with headphones tugged them down around his neck, his eyes widening as if hearing the song for the first time. On camera, Heidi's expression softened those small human reactions that silently say, "I recognize that feeling." Mateo continued, "I wish I was special." His voice cracked on special, but no one winced. The crack made it true. There was power in imperfection. It reminded people of their own private fractures. In his mind, Mateo wasn't in a stadium anymore. He was back in his classroom, staring at Jonah, the boy who always sat in the back. Always shrinking himself, always apologizing for existing. He thought of Maria, who stayed after school to erase the board because she didn't have any friends to walk home with. He thought of Daniel, who loved drawing but never showed his sketchbook to anyone because someone once laughed. These kids weren't failures or misfits, they were just waiting to be seen. Waiting for someone to say, "You matter." When Mateo hit the chorus, "But I'm a creep, I'm a weirdo," the line echoed through the arena like a painful joke everyone secretly related to. Not because they believed it, but because at some point in their lives, they had felt it. Felt too strange, too loud, too quiet, too different, too dream-filled, too everything. A camera panned across the judges' faces. There was no panel of critics, now just for adults remembering days when they, too, felt like outsiders. Simon's eyes, once analytical and guarded, now held a stillness that wasn't performance, it was recognition. Mateo didn't belt. He didn't try to impress, he let the emotion do the work, and the emotion carried more weight than volume ever could. By the final verse, the room was silent, not because they were bored, but because they didn't want to breathe too loudly and interrupt the honesty unfolding in front of them. And then came the last note. Not long, not powerful, just enough to land in the heart. And it did. It landed in thousands of hearts at once. The music faded. Mateo's shoulders sank. His eyes stayed closed, afraid to open to disappointment. But what waited for him was not disappointment. It was a kind of silence that only comes before something extraordinary. When Mateo's final note hung in the air, the arena was enveloped in a silence so profound it felt almost sacred. For a moment, no one dared to breathe. The audience's eyes were fixed, as if trying to absorb every ounce of honesty he had poured into those fragile lyrics. The judges sat frozen, their expressions unreadable, but their hands clenched slightly on the table, betraying the impact of what they had just witnessed. Then, slowly, a ripple of applause began, not loud at first, but deliberate. One hand clapped, then another. A few rows back, someone stomped the floor in rhythm. It was tentative, uncertain, like people testing the reality of the moment. And then it exploded, standing ovation, whistles, tears, and cheers filling every corner of the arena. Mateo's heart pounded against his ribs, a mix of relief, disbelief, and overwhelming emotion. He stepped back from the microphone, trembling, eyes still closed. For the first time in his life, Mateo realized that the voice he thought was too small to matter could reach thousands. That his stories, his students' stories, were not invisible. That his fears were not unique, but shared in quiet corners across the world. Backstage, the roar of the audience still thundered through the walls, but something else buzzed in his pocket. His phone vibrated. He reached for it almost instinctively, hands shaking, and saw the caller ID classroom video call. His heart skipped a beat. Sir. Sir. The voices of his students burst through the tiny speakers, overlapping in chaotic joy. Mateo's students, the children he had taught to read, write, and dream, were all huddled together, smiling, waving, and shouting across thousands of miles. Jonah held the camera, grinning from ear to ear. Maria was laughing uncontrollably. Even Daniel, who rarely spoke, whispered, Sir, you did it. Tears streamed down Mateo's face. He crouched to see the faces of the children who had unknowingly carried him to this stage. Their small hands pressed against the screen, their eyes wide with pride and wonder. You made it. They shouted, We knew you could. The classroom erupted in laughter, clapping, and even the scraping of chairs, echoing a joy far bigger than the walls that contained them. For Mateo, it wasn't the applause, the judges' praise, or even the chance to advance on a world stage that mattered most. It was this, seeing the children who had once been invisible feel seen, knowing that in pursuing his dream, he had lifted them. Simon approached him backstage, expression softer than Mateo had ever seen. You didn't just sing, Simon said quietly. You told a story. You gave a voice to people who need to hear it. That's something most performers never do in a lifetime. Mateo smiled through tears. I sang for my students, he whispered, and I hoped they'd hear it. Simon nodded. And now, the world has to buy. In that moment, Mateo realized that an act of courage within, a small one, could create ripples far beyond his imagination. He hadn't just performed a song. He had shared humanity itself. And in return, the world had responded with kindness, recognition, and awe. The stage lights had dimmed, but Mateo's heart was still ablaze. The roar of the audience had faded into a hum, leaving behind an electric energy he could feel buzzing in his veins. For a teacher who had spent his life quietly shaping lives, being here on this giant stage, in front of thousands of strangers, felt surreal. And yet, amidst all the cameras, the flashing lights, and the applause, his mind was not on fame, prizes, or recognition. His mind was on his students. When the producers asked him what he would do if he won, Mateo didn't hesitate. His answer came from the depths of his heart, shaped by years of selflessness and devotion. I want to fix the school roof, he said softly, his voice steady but filled with emotion. It leaks every rainy season. And I want to buy more books for the kids, so they can learn, read, and dream, just like I've always wanted them to." There was a pause, a moment when the room seemed to hold its breath. Then Simon leaned back in his chair, a rare smile softening his usually sharp features. "Now, that's why this matters," Simon said. "It's not about the perfect performance. It's about the impact you make, the people you lift along the way. That's real talent." Mateo's eyes glistened with tears. He hadn't gone to the stage seeking glory. He hadn't even gone to compete for himself. He had gone to honor the kindness of his students, to repay the faith of children who believed in him before he believed in himself. And in that moment, the world responded not with trophies or titles but with recognition of the purest kind of heroism, selflessness. As he stepped off the stage, Mateo thought of the ripple effect of simple acts of generosity. The students who had saved their pennies for his plane ticket had unknowingly taught him a lesson he would never forget: that kindness is louder than fear, stronger than doubt, and more powerful than talent alone. Sometimes, the courage to give even when you have so little can inspire others to believe, to act, and to hope. Simon walked beside him, the judges' applause still echoing faintly from the studio. "Remember this," Simon said quietly. "The world doesn't always notice the quiet ones, but the ones who care, the ones who lead with heart, they always leave a mark." Mateo nodded, understanding for the first time that he had done more than sing a song. He had carried a classroom of invisible kids across continents, and in doing so, reminded everyone watching that every act of love matters. That courage isn't measured in notes, hit or stages, conquered, it's measured in hearts touched. Outside, the world was waiting, millions of viewers, thousands of fans, and countless hearts that would be inspired by a teacher from Manila who dared to believe. But Mateo didn't think about the audience. He thought about Jonah, Maria, Daniel, and every child who felt small, unseen, or unheard. Because sometimes, the greatest victories are not trophies or titles. They are the moments when kindness, hope, and selflessness shine so brightly that they change lives forever. And in that moment, Mateo realized he hadn't just sung Creep, he had sung Hope, and that, he knew, was the most powerful performance of all.